You have cows, okay? And the cows need to drink. Now, you can keep the cows at bay through a fence where it's like, hey, all the cows are grouped together because there's a fence that they keep the herd in, or you can put a water source in the middle and the cows will stay close because of that water source. And I like to think of myself as a leader who's amongst his people and just keeps saying, here's where the water is. This is the water of life. Jesus is the source. And so it's like, I'm not trying to win people over by religious structure in the church, organizational structure in the church, processes. I'm trying to show them who Christ is and why he's valuable and have that be the center that changes their life, because then it's him, not me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sowers Podcast. My name is Matt Naismith, and I am your host. On this podcast, we share stories from church planters and leaders who are influencing kingdom movement and impacting their communities. Whether you're a church planter, a pastor in a church, part of a church planting team, or just curious to learn more, our hope is that these conversations inspire you to be a sower in the places where you live, work, learn, and play. If this podcast blesses you, we'd love for you to share episodes and subscribe on your preferred platform. Now, let's dive into our next conversation. Welcome, friends, to the Sowers Podcast. Thanks for joining us for this episode and this conversation. Before we get into our conversation today, I want to invite you to subscribe on YouTube, to hit follow on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. You can also rate us on any of those platforms. By you doing this, by you subscribing, following, liking, adding reviews, you help this podcast grow in its influence through the various algorithms of these platforms. So I know it seems small, but it would be a great help if you would go ahead and do that so that more people can hear this podcast and as a result, be inspired and equipped to become sowers of the gospel in the places where they live, work, learn, and play. Well, today I'm excited for you to hear a conversation that I had with Chris Monyé. Chris serves on the organizational leadership team for Village Church, a church with locations all across Canada. He's the lead pastor for Village Church Langley South, and he serves on the main teaching team for all of the Village sites. Chris is originally from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and he moved to Surrey in 2013 to complete his Master of Divinity after responding to a call to pastoral ministry. Chris is passionate about building relationships and seeing lives transformed by Jesus. Chris and his wife Mercedes have 4 sons, Jacob, Calvin, Theodore, and Beckham. In this conversation, Chris shares his remarkable journey into pastoral ministry, from starting as a probation officer and receptionist to becoming a lead pastor at Village Church. With humility and candidness, he reflects on the challenges of feeling out of depth and the growth that comes from embracing one's unique gifts and calling. I think you're going to be deeply blessed by this conversation. And so without further ado, here is my conversation with Chris Monyé. Well, Chris, a very special welcome to the Sowers Podcast. It's really great to have you on.
Thanks, Matt. I'm happy to be here, man. It's great to hang with you.
Chris, I remember the very first time I met you, it was at a TGC conference in Indianapolis. And I think I recognized you because I'd seen a Village video from Village Church in BC. And I think you and at the time, Mark Clark, you were chatting, doing like a small group curriculum. I think that was like a midweek thing. You maybe remember. And I looked down the aisle. I was like, hey, I think that's the guy from Village. And we were in Indianapolis. So I went over to you. We hit it off right away and had some conversations after that. But one of the things that I was so impressed by was your journey. So I was wondering if you would share right off the bat here, your ministry journey, where it began and then where you are now.
Yeah, totally. That was a great time, man. That was cool. Actually, I got to tell you something about that moment in Indianapolis, because I remember it. We were in one of the breakouts with Sam Alberry. He was talking about singleness and same-sex attraction. And that trip, I was like assessing a potential elder. So I took him on that trip, like with the agenda to like dig deep into his soul. So like you should have heard me whenever we were in the hotel alone, I was like trying to figure out who this guy was on every level. But you made me feel and made me seem like I was the coolest guy on the planet. Like, what? You're in Indianapolis of all places, and like this dude's like recognizes you. You made me feel really cool. So I gotta thank you for that moment. I don't know if I've ever formally said, dude, thanks for making me feel like the coolest guy.
Okay, very cool.
I think I felt cooler than Piper. It's been a journey. Like it's been a wild journey. So maybe I'll start even in the process of feeling called into pastoral ministry, because that I think was unique to what caused the journey to be what it is. Because I think anybody going through, ministry in this season of the church, and I'm saying this season because I think also going forward in Canada with the succession crisis that's coming, there's going to be a lot of options for young ministers and young people who are training up and being given opportunity in the church to maybe take steps beyond what they're capable for. This was called to me as being an underfill, where you have a lot of potential for a role, but maybe your experience isn't actually at that level for the job you're being given. And I feel like we're going to find people caught up in that. And that's been my journey the whole time. It's always felt like I'm out of my depth. It's like I do jiu-jitsu as a hobby. And like when I remember when I was given my purple belt and I called one of my coaches and said, dude, I got my purple belt. I don't feel like I'm ready. And he's like, you'll never feel like you're ready. Like, wow. Just know you will grow into the belt you're given. And so in the same way, it's like with people in the church and people in ministry and leadership and just hoping maybe feel called into something, oftentimes you grow into the responsibility that God gives you. And that's a great reminder that you aren't the one who's accomplishing the work of the church in the world. Like God uses us, but he works through us. And it's a beautiful way of keeping humble through the journey and the process. And that whole journey. So when the whole journey started, I was a probation officer for the province of Manitoba in Winnipeg. And the job felt awesome. Like it's called the Random Assault Unit. I was dealing with like high and very high risk clients who were like getting sentenced and convicted of crimes like assault, aggravated assault, robbery, armed robbery, manslaughter, things that felt like these are like legit serious crimes. And so you feel, I don't know why it makes you feel cool. It's like you're working with the bad, you know what I mean? They're just like, but also it's incredibly peaceful.
Did you have a uniform? Like maybe that was part of it.
No uniform, bro.
No uniform.
Like,
okay.
It's not in the correctional facilities. A lot of people might think this too. Probation officers they're like social workers. They work in the community. And so when someone's done their sentencing, often they'll have maybe in a correctional facility, provincial in Canada is 2 years minus a day. Everything above that for sentencing is federal. And so when they're in the community afterwards, often they'll have an order, like a probation order or a conditional sentence order. Conditional sentence is like house arrest. And probation, so they'd come and they have to report to a probation officer, and we'd have to go through what their probation things that they have to do, whether they have to take anger management or cognitive behavioral therapy or be in these kind of group homes or do these kind of programs or whatever it is, or just live a conventional lifestyle with great supports. And you just help them succeed in that. And so like you are in the correctional facilities, but when you're going into like write pre-sentence reports or glad you reports or things that are just helping people along. So anyways, that's all besides the point. But it started there because part of what the Canadian system in its restorative justice model cares a lot about people connecting to conventional supports. One of those being that spiritual practice and spiritual community really helps someone in their lower offense rate. So it's like finding people that they can connect to. And in that, I mean, you want to connect the person to what they're actually naturally with. So maybe someone has an Indigenous background. Well, Indigenous spirituality for them might be the best way to connect them into that support system. Maybe someone has a faith system where they're a Catholic or something. And so for me, having a history in the church, I was like, at this point, God had just like completely upended and wrecked my life in the way of my own salvation towards him. It was November 5th, 2012 that he called me into a relationship with him. Did that through a moment of existential crisis of wondering, man, God, do you even exist? All the stuff I was taught growing up. What if it doesn't exist? What if I die and nothing happens? This crazy thing. And a mentor just gave me a Bible and said, don't get distracted from the question. And so the Bible became like the foundational thing. And when I was talking with people in my office who had a spiritual background in any sort of Christian worldview or anything that was Bible-based at all, Judeo-Christian, anything, I just said, hey, would I be able to have my Bible with me at my desk? Could I be able to open it and go through it with them? And my area director at the time said, yeah, absolutely. And so this kind of cool ministry stuff was happening.
Yeah.
That put a bit of a mark on me in the office. And there's one man there who's a Vatican-trained priest. And he literally left the priesthood because he fell in love and now is a probation officer in Winnipeg. And like, what a wild story. And he told me I'd be a great priest. At that point, I was married with a kid. I said, bro, I have the same problem you have. I could not, like, that's not for me. Don't call me out of that. And then, but I had a friend who was very open about her beliefs in atheism. And she even said, no, you'd make a really great pastor. And so that was the beginning of even just searching and wondering what that could be like. And the calling process was profound because it caused my wife and I, because you're in it together. Like if your wife, you're married and your wife's not in, you're not called. It is like you are one through your covenant, and the Spirit of God lives in both of you, the same Spirit. And so we even had to go through a journey of being on the same page, but trusting that the Lord would bring that together. And he did for both of us, which was a big move. But we were we were praying through and asking people if they saw it in us and are these gifts we have. And we tested it against trusted, mature Christians, and they all affirmed it. And so my wife and I went into what we thought would be a season of preparation, and we applied to two schools, Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, and Acts seminaries on the West Coast. And people are like, well, why not Regent? But man, Acts is the Associated Canadian Theological Schools, fantastic seminary, and one that my friend had a lot of relationships in and said was great. And so we got accepted into both. But my mentor's wife had a dream that we had moved out west. And that was what caused Mercedes and I, who had only ever I think I came the farthest west I'd ever been in Canada prior to that was Banff, for a band competition or something like that. We went to one band, like that band trip you do in grade 11. And then my wife had been out here one time for a few weeks with a family member, and that was it. So we didn't have much experience with the West Coast of Canada. So when we actually did move out here for school, with the intention of potentially planting a church in Winnipeg, or Halifax is always on our hearts too. Two things, so, Halifax and Winnipeg were always these two places that God had stirred our hearts towards. We didn't know what British Columbia had for us. And so we came out for seminary and got out here, went to one church, a friend had said, hey, you should check it out. And didn't really feel like any sort of deep connection to the church. The reason being, my wife and I, when we were in Winnipeg, we were connected with an incredibly missional church in downtown. Well, it's in Elmwood. It's called Riverwood Church Community. And they are just all about the community that they serve. They just are all about it. So they bought an old fire hall and renovated it. They bought a whole warehouse and renovated. They just do these projects and they care for the community they're in. And my wife and I love that. So we'd be out minus 40, putting door knockers, inviting people out to things. And I was scraping paint off the fire hall. It's really cool to be part of a church that's missional for the community it's in. And so when I asked the administrative woman at the seminary, hey, what churches are here? She pulled out a binder and started talking through church names. And she says oh, this church has such a great community. You should go here. And then she gets to one called Village Church. And she says, oh, Village Church, go there if you want to be overworked, and then move to the next one. So for a lot of people, that would sound overworked sounds like a negative. Man, if you care about your well-being, your personal well-being and your balance of life, don't go there. What I interpreted it as, and what I taught when I talked to Mercedes about, what she interpreted it as well, was there's opportunity to be on mission. The church is doing things. And so we went there for one Sunday. And that Sunday, it was so special because Mark Clark at the time, who was the planting pastor for Village Church, he's now down in Sacramento with Bayside Church in California, doing an incredible job down there. So much love for him. And he's such a big part of my story. He was preaching on the mission of the church that day. And he came down off the stairs in the Bell Center, which you normally would not do, getting to know him. And I just met him right there on the side of the thing and said, hey, man, can I just tell you my story of why my wife and I are out here? And the Spirit of God in that moment, he says, talk to him. And it also talked to my friend Buffy Paul, who was overseeing our kids ministry. And they talked. And then Mark and the executive pastor took me out that week and sat me down at a coffee shop and grilled me about everything, about my sexual integrity, about old porn habits, about what I'm doing out here, what my calling is, what my theology, what I see myself as. Am I a builder? Am I a king? Am I all these things from books I hadn't read that they were reading. And these poor 16-year-old girls sitting next to us in the coffee shop. We had about one, when the tight coffee, they were basically part of the conversation, and I'm just letting my heart loose on everything. So it was wild. But then after that, they offered me a position at the church. And here's where it starts getting really interesting in the way of, I believe God calls in some bigger ways where he just calls you into, let's say, a pastoral calling that may not actually be a vocational calling. So I could have been a pastor as a probation officer in my calling, as a shepherd, as I work out the giftings that God has placed into my life. Mm-hmm. But he was also moving me. What we thought was a season of preparation was actually the beginning of a vocational calling that we've been living out for now we're going on 12 years at Village Church. And so here's how that changed. And I want to tell this one story, if it's okay, Matt, if I'm not running this story too long. But this was a major shift in my understanding of how to operate in your gifting vocationally without dealing with the consistent discontentment that sometimes a role will bring into your life. Here's what I mean before I tell the story. A lot of people and a lot of pastors that I've seen, or a lot of young workers in ministry, they feel very discontent because there's a gap between where they are in their role with the responsibilities and the authority they carry and where they feel called to be. So you have this major gap where someone's coming in and maybe being prepared for ministry, but they feel like they can do more. They feel like they should be given more authority, that they have more experience, that their opinions count, and they do count, but I'm saying in the sense of they should be guiding and directing the vision and the application of an organization they're working for well beyond their actual vocational role. And what happens is a tension and a us versus them or a me versus them or whatever language you want to use starts to begin with the higher leadership and the internal discontentment of that person. When that happens, a few options become available. One is that people start to think the grass is greener in another opportunity. And sometimes it works itself out in practical ways where it's like, hey, I want to be making this much money because my friend who I think I'm a little bit better than is doing something like that in another church. And why aren't I getting the same thing?
Yeah, there's some
and
envy.
People share their salaries and talk about it. So we can't pretend that people aren't. It's very open communication around that now. But you get to this, so it's like, yeah, this discontentment takes place, and it's or you start like really jockeying for your own position. Yet when the scripture tells us that it's no, you are to humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, and he will exalt you. He will lift you up. It's like there's a trustworthiness in God's movement of your vocation and your leadership and your authority and your responsibility that has to be central to the story of your life if you're going to do ministry well and if you're going to carry it under him. And so when I was offered the position, this is a unique position, and I don't know if it exists in anywhere else in the world, but it also helps frame what Village Church was doing differently back in its early days. This was still like a very young church at that point. Village had only been around for 2.5, now going on 3 years. When I was there, I was hired on a month into living here in British Columbia. So everything was still new. A week after I had like met Mark. So 1 week later, I was working full time for the church. But the initial role they offered me was the role of a pastoral apprentice. Now, this was like the dream job for what I could imagine. Here's what it entailed. A $40,000 a year salary, okay? Village would pay for all of my post-secondary education, my master's degree as I'm working in it. When I'm in school, that's considered work hours. Village, meaning Mark and the team, did some work to connect with other churches that needed pulpit supply. And as a pastoral apprentice, I would do pulpit supply with them. You get a book allowance monthly for the church. So if you're buying textbooks or books you just want to read of theology, and you're being poured into consistently about your teaching and all these other things, like tell me that's not a dream development role for someone young. And this is like 11, 12 years ago. So even the 40K goes a lot longer, a lot farther than it does now in a whole bunch of respects. And so I was like, man, I couldn't believe it. God, thank you so much for what you've done. And I had a meeting with the executive pastor where I was going to go and sign the paperwork. I was like, Mercedes and I were on cloud nine. Wow, God, you're so good. And the executive pastor sits me down and says, Chris, I have a curveball. He says, we have a need for a receptionist. I said, well, what's that like? Okay, it pays $27,000 a year. You don't get any help with school, no allowance on books, no time to go to school. If you have school, it's a 9 to 5 strict Monday to Friday, but you are expected to volunteer and serve at the church because at that time on our job descriptions, there was a line that we found out was illegal later, so we canceled it. We took it off, but it was and volunteer hours as needed. And so it's like, you have your 40-hour work week, but you're also expected to do as much and more as you can. And so that was there. So that's no longer on any of them. But at that time, it's like, okay, this is a pretty like the role. And so of course I said to the executive pastor, I said, are both offers on the table? He said, both offers are on the table, but you have to tell me by tomorrow. And so I went home that night with a very strange wrestle. And the only reason it was strange is because the Spirit of God was compelling me and convicting me to take the receptionist role, even though it was economically worse, opportunity worse, and none of the on paper worked at all.
Right.
I wrestled with the Spirit, and I still have the email until 5 a.m. the next day on the floor of our basement suite, laying on the carpets, like at the seat. Like it was, and I like with tears and like legit, it was just like this overwhelming experience of, if I was to say yes to the pastoral apprentice job, which seemed right in every way, it would be disobedient to what God was asking me to do. Now that is the difference of calling and vocation. It's the conviction of God outside of any other economic or, like job structure or anything else that would drive you, where you feel compelled by God to do something that doesn't seem well, like in your own personal life. But he had so much work he wanted to do on me in that. So I sent an email to the executive pastor. I said, man, thanks so much for the opportunity. I decided to take the receptionist position, but I would love to still be developed. And when I can do pulpit supply, he didn't email me back. He sent me a text, said, great, come in and sign the paperwork. And I started as the receptionist of Village Church. And so that's the beginning of that story. And it was an incredibly beautiful and hard and stretching journey in that seat.
Friends, we'll get back to my interview with Chris de Monyé in just a moment. Prior to that, however, I want to let you know about Message Canada. In Canada, Message Canada is raising up and equipping a new generation of evangelists through their small mentoring advanced groups, advanced evangelism summits, and evangelist gatherings. They long to see deprived communities transformed through the incarnational ministry of their Eden teams who show and share the love of Jesus in word and action. Through their global network, they're also equipping and training young people through the Message School of Evangelism, and they want to see young lives transformed in schools and youth camps across the country through the establishment of creative mission teams. Annually, Message Canada hosts the Advance Summit, and this year it's happening from February 25th to 27th in Calgary. They want to invite you to join them as they gather to fan the flame of evangelism in their lives and churches, and together they believe to be encouraged, equipped, and empowered to share the love of Jesus boldly. If you'd like to learn more about Message Canada and the Advance Summit, you can visit advancesummit.org. Once again, that is advancesummit.org. And now back to my interview with Chris. Well, maybe what you can do for us from there then is to just share with us the different roles that you started as a receptionist and what you're doing now. And this isn't in any way to illustrate, hey, everybody, if you take the receptionist role, you'll eventually be a senior leader in the church, but to really indicate, no, what we're invited to do, as you said, is to humble yourself before the mighty hand of God. He will exalt you. And what you're saying is do the calling.
Yeah.
Do what God's called you to do. So just track with us just briefly here, the different roles you had, like the job description roles.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so I'll give you the full gap and I'll show you everything on the way. No, maybe I'll just build it up. I'll do the build up. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, started as a receptionist at the church. In that role, lots of opportunities. In that role, I did end up doing pulpit supply for some other local churches and was offered a couple other pastoral jobs while I was even at the reception desk. I remember elders would call me at the church office to talk to me about these other roles. And I'd say, man, we just can't talk now. I'd have to hang up as a receptionist.
I'm answering the call for the church that is currently paying me.
Exactly. It was wild. It was, mind you, it was encouraging. Like it felt like, oh, okay, I'm still on the right track to what I do feel called to.
And they know how to get a hold of me.
Well, that's just it. Yeah, you know where to reach me. Like, you know where I'm going to be. I'm at this one L-shaped desk. And I thought I was like, I took that reception role and I worked it, dude. Like if you came in, like we had one Keurig machine and like a thing for hot chocolate. And I ask you, are you thirsty? Would you like some water? Do you want it to be cold or room temperature? Because you might have sensitive teeth. I don't know. Do you want like some coffee? Do you want me to make you a mocha? And I would like I figured out the right stir rate, everything to make an incredible mocha out of a Keurig and some hot chocolate mix and some deep cream. And like, dude, I'd set people up. So like, listen, you got to lean into the role you're in no matter what. And what I still hear today is that what I've done in that role, connecting with people, made a difference for their journey with Jesus in a profound way. Sometimes it's like, and that's what I think we have to recognize in the gaps. It's like what God puts your hand to now is good. It's real critical mission to the work of Jesus in the world. Why stifle it by being discontent that you're not there yet? I tell you, I'm going to tell you my journey now in a second. Everything along the way feels the same when you're leaving it at Jesus' feet. Right. It feels the same. I feel the same now as I do in my competence and capabilities as I did as a receptionist 12 years ago. The difference is just the scope or maybe the responsibility I carry or some of even how people view you changes, which can be to your detriment. You have to be so careful as how other people project things onto you in pastoral ministry. But it's been like a beautiful journey. So I was a receptionist for a year, a calendar year. Okay. In that, did a whole bunch of things with kids ministry and like serving the church and getting to know all the different routes. And I learned so much. And actually, what God did in that season that was the most profound thing was he grew my love for the local church while I was the receptionist of the church, because you learn every in and out of what happens. You see how everybody engages with every layer of person in the organization. You see how people look down on you. I went once on a trip with Mark and I was the receptionist at the time. And the guy there told me that I was just an accessory and Mark was actually who everybody wanted. It's like all these kind of things happen to you along the way that help remind you that you can't find your identity in other things. You have to find it in Jesus as you serve him. Then from that, I moved and they asked me to coordinate community groups. At this point, the church was probably like 1,600 people, but we had like maybe like 19 groups that were meeting on their own. And so I took that over, and just the idea was just to equip them and start building. And we had a new woman named Kristen Maynard, who's incredible, come in as the receptionist and take over for me from that seat. So I was freed up to do some other things. After coordinating the groups for like, I don't know, a month and a half, like God was just given vision for what it could be. And that's when I launched that idea to Mark and the team saying, hey, what if we were to do a video curriculum and we were still burning DVDs at that point and uploading it online. And the turnaround was crazy because you never knew what Mark was actually going to say until it came out of his mouth. And so when you're like, I'm building curriculum for him that has to be out that Sunday for groups. So I'm watching the sermon 8:30 a.m. And then I am just like building all the content, recording a video, putting it out. So it started just one-on-one. Then I thought, man, what if we did with Mark? The two of us talking together. And then we ended up having him in and we'd shoot that afterwards, or we shoot it early Monday morning and change the whole scope. But I did that for about a month before I pitched the vision of what it could be. And they gave me oversight as a director of community groups. So now I'm overseeing all community groups. And part of that vision was connecting the groups of the church to like a local missional posture of the church. So it's like, hey, what can we do in the city that we're part of, all of that. And so I got to build that. And so I started making connections and hung out with the mayor and started building like partnerships that we had and elevating other ones. And we built a couple of ministries from people at Village Church that grew and are currently ones that are thriving in some really cool ways. So that was like a pairing of the community groups and the local mission. And then from that, I moved on to be what they called the site leader, because they still weren't ready to give me a pastoral title yet. I think they're just still learning who I was and getting to know me. And they moved along. They had never once until years later actually moved somebody into a pastoral position internally. It was always external hires who they felt were qualified. And when I say they, it's like Mark and the executive team of the church, the people who are operating, incredible, trustworthy, awesome leaders, and the elders of the church. But I made the site leader of our 4 p.m. service location. At that point, the 4 p.m., we had just planted the site that I currently oversee now, which is our Langley South location from it. So we had 4 services at the Bell Center of Performing Arts, which is our broadcasting location that we rent. We don't own anything. We rent all of it. We have land that one day we hope to build on that. We're going to build and talk more about that this year, but we rent everything. So we have the Bell Center, and then we had one 4 p.m. service. It's like a service alternative, but it grew to about 700 people really quickly, and then grew to about 1,000 people. And so at 1,000 people, we got an opportunity to move further out in Surrey, in Langley. We saw on the heat map, we had lots of people coming from the eastern parts of the valley. So that made a lot of sense. And then 700 people moved from that 4 p.m. service down to that other location. But when that happened, you still have this 4 p.m. service. Who's going to oversee it, right? The lead pastor there, he moved over, and then I ended up taking over that 4 p.m. service as a site leader. Interesting thing about a 4 p.m. service in the Lower Mainland is it served a lot of people who maybe didn't have a church experience because they were serving at their own church, or they were pastoring at another church, and this became a place for them to actually get fed by the Spirit of God, meet with Jesus. And so of the 300-400 people that were coming, only 130 of them were committed, like, this is my home church. And the majority of people were actually people who were coming, I missed my services this morning, or we decided to sleep in, so we come to Village this afternoon, all of that kind of transient.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, of a community. So we ended up then deciding as a team that we wanted to move it to the morning. We'd like to keep where it was it's called Pacific Academy. It's like a private school here in the Lower Mainland, but it just didn't work out. And this is interesting too. And I don't think you realize it about ministry sometimes. The thing that was the breaking point of us using that space on a Sunday morning was the parking that was available because other groups were meeting there. So we had I don't even know, 60 spaces across 11 different locations on the campus, nothing central. It wouldn't have been a great user experience for anybody coming, for any new person. And so we decided to try and figure something else out. And that's when we came up with this idea of a cinema church model to plant locations that are gospel-centered using video from the Bell Center. Like if you were to watch an orchestra, one shot, everything, worship included. So like if you come in, you see the worship, you see some of the setup, you see the sermon, it's all one with a couple pause points for a local pastor to talk to his congregation. And my wife and I planted the first Cineplex location with Village Church up in North Langley from that 4 p.m. kind of core of people who called it home. And that was huge. So then I went from being a lead pastor of that location. 4 months later, Mark asked me to take over our broadcasting location at the Bell Center as the lead pastor there. And then through 2.5-3 years later, I was asked to actually, if I would consider becoming the lead pastor of the location that I'm at right now, which is called Langley South in the Fraser Valley on Fraser Highway, a little bit more east of Vancouver. And it's an incredible location, but I wear 3 hats now, Matt, for the organization. One, I'm a teaching pastor for the whole church. We are a teaching team model. As Mark moved on to Bayside, it opened up for some of us to kind of get some opportunity to teach, and a few of us were affirmed in our gifts. So there's 4 people who are on this teaching team, and we rotate and teach various frequencies, but quite similar. All of us teach between 10 to 16 times a year to actually break up the year in what we do. So I teach once a month at the Bell Center, and then I will go and teach at Langley South as a teaching pastor for the church. So I'll do that live there and then live the next week. That's because of how we record things. And then I'm also on if you think, it's called the organizational leadership team. It's like the executive team of the church. So the team that's overseeing the larger scale vision, overseeing what's happening across Canada with the different locations. And then I'm also a lead pastor of the Langley South location of Village Church. So those are the 3 hats that I wear in different responsibilities. And so everything that goes with the life and breadth and vision and direction and pastorship of that congregation in Langley, that's what I oversee as well. So that's a bit of what the trajectory's been like. And like I said, it's like, a wild ride, all sorts of moments where it's like, man, I'm out of my depth, Jesus. And he shows up, but he calls us to be faithful in it. Yeah.
So receptionist, when you had the opportunity to do the pastoral apprenticeship to now serving on the senior executive leadership team and being one of the primary communicators, that when people think of Village Church, you're one of the people that they think about listening to.
Yeah.
What have been, you shared a little bit along the way, but as you now have reflected upon that journey for us here on this podcast, what surprises you about that experience?
Yeah, it's, there are hard moments along the way. Like that gap that I talked about is very real, of when you think you're somewhere where you shouldn't be or what you desire to be. Part of my journey was Mark he's an incredible teacher, and he's gifted in how he communicates the gospel. And that opened up a lot of opportunities for him to speak in all sorts of different contexts all over North America. But Mark is also very careful about his character. And sometimes you don't see this kind of stuff, but because of that, he always had someone traveling with him. Now, because his wife was, homeschooling his girls and taking care of them in such a beautiful way, Erin's such a great mom, Mark would ask someone to travel with him. And he decided that I'd be that guy who gets to go on all these trips with him. And so when you get a seat like that, you start to run in circles that you have no business being in. So you're meeting guys that you're reading, you're hanging out with people and having dinners with guys. I remember sitting with one pastor at a dinner, and he gathers a bunch of leaders, and he gathers a bunch of leaders. He calls them his young eagles. And I said, hey, would I ever be able to come to one of those events? Like, that sounds so cool. And he said, no. And I said, oh, why? He said, because you're not the main guy. Like, no number 2s are in this group. And I thought to myself, man, that's so, at that point for me, it was kind of heartbreaking, because I would have loved to be in that, considered for a group. I would love to learn. I'd love to be around.
You want to be a young eagle.
I'd love to be a young eagle, man. I got wings. Let me fly, baby. Right. And so it was so wild, because what happened in my heart, it was in Florida. We were in Orlando, and I had another pastor friend with me too. And I was in the hot tub later that night, just upset, because Matt, it's wild to me that I'm teaching right now at the capacity I am, because I acknowledge that God's given me a teaching gift, and I don't hate it. I love teaching. It's really special, really, really honored that I get to share the word of God in the context that I do, and in any context that I'm invited into. But I was upset that God gave me more of a shepherdy gift. I love my congregation. It's the best church experience my wife and I've ever had. I feel like I'm just part of the community, not above it in any way. I'm just operating my gifts. I got friends who call me out and are with me in so many different ways. It's beautiful. And I feel that's the way I'm meant to operate. I could sit and chat and be in people's lives and really lead teams and develop culture. And I love and seeing young people get mentored in the faith and into their callings and believing in people. I have these high belief gifts, and I was upset about them. And I'm sitting in a hot tub, and I'm just man, why don't I have a teaching gift like that? Why would God give me this? I don't want this. I desire to be in those circles. I desire to run with that stuff. And in that moment in the hot tub, I look over, and a guy's trying to get back into the hotel, but he clearly can't. So I walk over, I have my key card. I said, bro, here, let me let you in. And when I see the guy, I don't know him at all. He just you can tell he's sad about something's weighing on him. So I asked him, dude, are you okay? And he said, no. He's man, I lost someone, his grandmother in my family. I didn't get to say goodbye. We were so close. And I said, do you have, did she have any belief system or background? Do you? And he said, no. And I said, listen, I believe there's a God that loves you and might want to comfort you in this moment. I said, can I just pray for you? Now, remember, I'm dripping wet, half naked in Florida. This is weird, man, holding the door to a hotel. We're halfway in, halfway out. And the guy says yes. And so I just put my hand on his shoulder. I just start praying for him, just that the healing and comfort of Jesus would be with him, peace. And he just collapses into my arms, and I'm just hugging this guy. And in that moment, while I'm praying and hugging this guy, this man that I don't know, I just feel like, and I don't get a lot of audible nothing, but I just felt like this. It felt like God was just saying to me, this is good too. This is good too.
Wow.
The gift I've given you is good for what I'm calling you to. And then I went back to my friend in the hot tub, and he had took a picture of the moment and said, did you just see what God did right there? I said, yeah, I did. I saw it. And so it did something in my soul, Matt. It caused me to realize, and what he's continued to do in this season, where he's giving me things that I resigned myself from having. I said, okay, I'm not going to be that teaching pastor. I'm not going to have that teaching opportunity. I'm not going to do those things. I'm going to lean into my gifts. And now he's opened up a world of things I didn't actually anticipate. I actually didn't resign myself to them, but said it's just not for me. And I came to like a very honest, like contentment without them. And it's been really beautiful just to be me. And I think that's another struggle. It's like, man, we watch all these great communicators. Generally, that's who we follow, or great thought leaders, and a lot of great pastors all over, like being faithful all over the planet, that you don't get to hear from or don't get to see their story when you're running after it for yourself. They're doing incredible work. And that place is just as honorable and just as like needed, and it takes just as much faith and conviction and courage to be seated in that calling. And I felt okay with who I was. And when you're watching all these great thought leaders and watching all these great speakers, I think one trap that leaders fall into is they try and emulate who they are, when we're actually just called to emulate who Jesus is. And so you don't want to not be yourself in the midst of your walk with Jesus, because you'll end up comparing yourself to what other people do, and that kind of comparison will kill you. And so, yeah, that's been a huge piece of my journey. And I think of everyone in this kind of things, learning who you actually are, and then just being you. And whether that turns out to opportunity or not, that's how you're going to find contentment, because you actually won't want something that you're not built for. You won't. Like if you get something and you work hard for it and you get it, and you are actually not built for it, you won't have a desire for it long term. And I think that'll do something to your soul and to your practice as you follow Jesus with it.
Over the years, the church has grown. How have you found that you have been able to continue to shepherd people well as a community grows?
Yeah. Part of it is who you bring in to help you shepherd that community. The co-pastorship that happens. One of the greatest strengths of Village Church, where it is, if any of your listeners are unfamiliar with its story, at this point it's 7 locations across Canada: Toronto, Winnipeg, Calgary, 4 in the Lower Mainland, from Vancouver to 2 in Surrey, 1 in Langley. And we operate as sites, but with pastoral teams and staff teams for each of the different locations that carry, like, as much as it feels like Village Church, and we want certain things to feel like Village across the board, each location has its own unique feel for the community that's part of, for the people that it serves. And you see that in the demographic of the church and beyond. And so as we try and operate in what it is, you're still getting like a unique experience from every location. Can you repeat your question, Matt? Because now I'm running.
Well, I'm wondering how as you were affirmed in that moment, like that hot tub moment was kind of affirming and saying, okay, I'm a shepherd. I need to lean into this shepherding. And I would say that sometimes people think, okay, to be a good shepherd, my capacity will be, 100 people, right? Well, you're now still at that time, you're serving in this larger church that's continuing to grow. You're being invited to be put in roles where you're a lead pastor of a site, which certainly has an element of shepherding, but how have you engaged shepherding as the church has grown?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and where I was going with that was so pastors on the ground, you have a responsibility for the people you're over to actually care for. And so when you're if any sort of leader, I think one of the things that happens is we separate ourselves and we base it on responsibility or things that we're carrying, where it's like, hey, I'm so busy in other things, I don't have time for the people I'm serving. And that can happen in so many ways. We see lots of leaders get isolated from the people they're called to serve, especially ones who maybe primarily have to teach or primarily have to carry like 30,000 foot, 50,000 foot vision for something, and they just seem a little bit separate from it. The practice that I try and continue is, one, to have real community from my church in my life. So I'm never far away, because if you looked at my life right now, Matt, my closest friends, the people I find accountability with, They're all from my local community that I'm pastoring. And so that causes me to be very authentic and honest with people that I'm serving on a regular basis and serving with. The second is to make yourself available. Like currency for a leader right now is accessibility. Like my friend Brad Lomnick talks about this and says like the leader of the future will be accessible. You need to cut out the middleman. You have to be with and alongside your people. And so that comes with highs and lows. It's like in my tenure at Village Church, I've done over 140 weddings, but I've also done a bunch of funerals. It's like you're there in every context of their life. And I'm at the point now where it's like I'm dedicating families like children and parents who I've done weddings for, who I've done premarital counseling for, who I've baptized, who I've walked into a relationship with Jesus. Like this is like so cool to watch this full circle pastorship. And that excites me. So for me, it's not really a labor to be in people's lives and to continue to pastor them. In fact, that's where I'll err to. And it plays out in certain things that make me maybe less of like an organizational, lover in certain things. Like, so it's like, if I'm with a person and they're walking with something heavy and that means I'm going to be late for my next meeting, well, I'm not going to cut that person off in that moment of what they're carrying. I'm going to communicate to my next meeting, I'm going to be late. And this person's taking my priority because they're who I'm with and who God has me with in that moment. So it's a posture of unhurried presence is what will keep you close to your community. And I mean presence as in you are available with people who you are leading. They know you. They know your blind spots. They know your struggles. They know your wife. They know your kids. They know if you're a present dad or not because your family is part of that community too. And you have authentic community, and the gap between who that person sees on stage when you're preaching and who you are is much smaller because they know both of them intimately. And so that's so my favorite place to preach right now is at my home church. It's like the Bell Center of Performing Arts where we set up the capture and how well the cameras, and it's a performing arts theater. Like it's set up to look cool. It's not my favorite place to preach. My favorite place to communicate the gospel is to the congregation that I'm walking with, through the congregation that I've walked through loss with, and the loss of children and infertility and cancer diagnosis and loss of spouses and bearing parents. Because as a pastor, I'm called to be a curer of souls, to care for people, to direct them to Jesus, to oversee them in the sense of not authority, but in love, to help them love Christ more. And there's two ways people try and do this as they pastor. Think of a flock of cattle, okay? Like, I don't know if you call it cattle flock, but a group of cows. You got cows. Okay, you got a bunch of cows. A herd, thank you. Yeah, I'm not raised in the
Me neither, but I'm surprised that came to mind.
That was great. That's fantastic. I had no idea what to call it. A herd of cows. You have cows, okay? And the cows need to drink. Now, you can keep the cows at bay through a fence where it's like, hey, all the cows are grouped together because there's a fence that they keep the herd in, or you can put a water source in the middle and the cows will stay close because of that water source. And I like to think of myself as a leader who's amongst his people and just keeps saying, here's where the water is. This is the water of life. Jesus is the source. And so it's like, I'm not trying to win people over by religious structure in the church, organizational structure in the church, processes. I'm trying to show them who Christ is and why he's valuable and have that be the center that changes their life, because then it's him, not me. And I think that's how, like in the idea of pastorship, it's like that mindset. It's like, it's not about what I can accomplish. It's not about who I am. It's about being present with my people and pointing them to Christ in everything I do. And in seminary, that became, we did a rule of life, and we worked through all of that incredible practice for your life if you're going to walk with Jesus in any sort of vocational sense. Or not, even if you're just trying to, live out your life well. But this, my rule of life became that in every conversation and moment I have with someone, to move them one step closer to Jesus. And I'm not perfect in that, of course, but the rule of life just helps you to identify this is what I'm made for. And that's been really helpful.
Chris, as we close, I'm wondering if you could share, you've shared with us a number of lessons along the way. So maybe what you could do is, if you're looking into the face of the Chris from 12 years ago.
Yeah.
What is the one thing that you would want that Chris to hear?
Dude, you're loved by the only one that matters. People are going to let you down, but that doesn't change your worth. Ministry is incredibly transient. Don't get hurt by it. Still build deep relationships. They're meaningful for the time you have them. No matter where or what you're preaching, like, it is the idea of an audience of one. It's for Jesus. And your family will never, ever consider you someone replaceable. So never replace them in the value of your life. Like, if you ask my boys, who does daddy love the most? They will tell you, every one of them, even my 4-year-old, mommy, without a doubt. And that's not to the extent that I love my boys any less than I could. It's just they know the priorities in my life and they know they're first. Like, even if I've told them and they live up to it, in some ways that's bad. I remember, dude, I was praying for one lady who's going through a cancer diagnosis, and my third runs up and punches me right in the crotch, like as hard as he can while I'm like mid prayer, just completely folds me. But he knows his dad's accessible anytime. And it's just like, yeah, there's a bit of like, that's wild. But it's also creating an environment in my home where they don't feel second class to the church. They don't feel second class to what I do. And I think that's really important to keep that in mind as you're doing something that can be demanding. There's no time off, like if something happens, you're still there, and you can take rest and you can Sabbath and all that's really good, but you're still responsible for people that you're called to love. And the last thing would be this, Matt, it's that Jesus says that his yoke is light. He doesn't say it's not going to be weighty. I think it's learning what it's like to carry weight without it feeling heavy. And you do that by staying close to Christ. Yeah.
Chris, thank you for sharing so openly and honestly with us on the Sowers Podcast.
Matt, you're a gift, man. Thank you for doing this, and thanks for having me.
Well, friends, I'm sure you would agree that there is so much from my conversation with Chris that could be applied as this episode's action step. In addition to all of the incredible truths that Chris shared, you could also sense, I'm sure, his energy as I left the conversation with him feeling energized, encouraged, lifted up, built up. And so I trust that you're also feeling the same way today. The thing that I want to focus on, however, is a theme that I think is very important in the realm of pastoral work and the pastoral vocation and as followers of Jesus. And that is our presence in our vocations, and in particular, how we're doing in our soul and in our lives related to contentment. Chris talked about leaving everything that he does at the feet of Jesus. And when he leaves what he does at the feet of Jesus, he is further as it relates to his own contentment. He talked about how we can waste seasons by being discontent and not trusting where God has us. And a huge part of Chris's story was trusting the Lord in the various seasons and the places that God had him. And that journey has grown him, as I'm sure you could tell just listening to him, that he's grown in his leadership. He's grown in his capacity. He's grown through experience as God was sharpening him to be able to enable him to do the things that he is doing today. And so I want to invite you to spend some time in prayer, to maybe spend some time journaling related to the place that God has you and how you can lay where he has you at his feet. I think this is such a key thing for many of us who want to be further along, or maybe we're just experiencing some displeasure with where we currently are right now. And so hopefully you can spend some time talking to Jesus about that, hearing what he has to say, laying it at his feet, and trusting him to then provide contentment in your spirit and in your soul. Well, friends, as always, thank you for listening to this podcast. It's been a joy having you with us. Next week, there is going to be a recap episode in which I'll dig deeper into my conversation with VJ, with Joanna, with Ashwin, and also with Chris. So you can look out for that episode next week. Thanks, friends. You are loved.